19 days. That is all the time left before the United States hosts the single largest sporting event on the planet, the FIFA World Cup, a tournament that was supposed to deliver billions of dollars in tourism revenue, fill every hotel room from New York to Los Angeles, and remind the world why America remains the ultimate destination for global gatherings. Supposed to. Because last week, the American Hotel and Lodging Association released a survey that stopped me cold. Nearly 80% of hotels across all 11 World Cup host cities are reporting booking levels that are tracking below their original forecasts. Not slightly below, meaningfully below. Some hoteliers are privately describing the tournament as, and I am quoting directly here, a non-event. And here is the number that I cannot stop thinking about. For 15 consecutive months, the volume of Canadians traveling into the United States has declined, month after month after month. Statistics Canada recorded 2.6 million Canadian trips to the United States in March of 2026, alone a 6.4% drop compared to the same month the year before. Canada, America's largest trading partner, America's closest neighbor, pulling back. I spent 3 days going through these reports, and what I found underneath the surface is not the story anyone is telling you right now. Stay with me. Let me be precise about what we are actually looking at here. Because this is where most analysis goes wrong. People see a headline, they reach for the nearest political explanation, and they stop digging. I am not going to do that to you. Let us start with the data exactly as it exists. Statistics Canada is not a partisan organization. It is the federal statistical agency of the Canadian government. It counts things. And what it has been counting for 15 consecutive months now is a steady, uninterrupted decline in the number of Canadians crossing into the United States, whether by land, by air, or by sea. In March of 2026, 2.6 million Canadian trips were made to the United States. That sounds like a large number, and it is. But here is what makes it significant. That figure represents a 6.4% contraction compared to March of 2025. And that contraction did not appear suddenly. It has been building quietly and consistently since early 2025. Now here is the distinction that changes everything. Canadians are not traveling less. They are traveling differently. This is not a story about a population retreating indoors, cutting budgets, staying home. The data shows something far more deliberate. Canadian outbound tourism to destinations other than the United States has held steady or increased during the same period. Mexico, the Caribbean, European capitals. These markets have absorbed Canadian travelers who, in previous years, would have driven across the border or booked a flight to Florida. What you are looking at is not a contraction in demand. It is a redirection of demand. And in economic terms, those are two entirely different phenomena with two entirely different sets of implications. Now layer on top of that what is happening with the FIFA World Cup. The American Hotel and Lodging Association surveyed its members across all 11 host cities including New York, Los Angeles, Dallas, Miami, Seattle, Kansas City, and others. The result, published in early May of 2026, was striking. Nearly 80% of respondents reported that advance bookings were tracking below original projections. Only 1/4 of those surveyed described seeing what the association called meaningful incremental lift, and even that was concentrated in markets with already strong baseline leisure demand or in cities hosting team base camps. Oxford Economics, an independent economic research firm, released its own assessment around the same period. Their projection, the metropolitan areas hosting World Cup matches will see some localized GDP growth this summer, primarily in the leisure and hospitality sectors. However, and this is the sentence that deserves your full attention, that growth, in their words, will not have a material impact on the country's overall jobs and economic gains for the year. Read that again. One of the most prestigious sporting events in human history, hosted across 11 American cities, And the most credible independent economic forecast available says the national impact will not be material. That was the optimistic scenario. What the AHLA survey is now suggesting is that even that modest projection may be under pressure. So we have two data streams running in parallel: a 15-month decline in Canadian travel to the United States, and a World Cup hospitality sector that is underperforming its own conservative forecasts with 19 days remaining before kickoff. These are the facts as they stand: verifiable, sourced, documented. What they do not tell us on their own is why, and they certainly do not tell us whether these two trends are connected, coincidental, or something else entirely. That is the question I want to dig into now, because the answer, depending on which layer you look at, changes the entire shape of this story. Here is where I need you to slow down with me, because the instinct, the very human, very understandable instinct, is to connect these two data points and call it a conclusion. 15 months of declining Canadian travel, 80% of World Cup hotels underperforming. The narrative writes itself, does it not? Except that is exactly the kind of thinking that produces bad analysis. So before we go any further, I want to do something that most commentators are not willing to do. I want to stress test the story. I want to look at the variables that nobody is putting on the table. Because if we cannot explain what else might be driving these numbers, we have no business drawing conclusions about what is. Let us start with the World Cup booking figures. The AHLA survey measures performance against original forecasts. That is an important detail. It does not measure performance against last summer. It does not measure performance against a neutral baseline. It measures performance against projections that were built, in many cases, during a period of peak optimism about the tournament's economic potential. Forecasts made when the assumption was that a World Cup on American soil would automatically generate unprecedented international demand. When you set your benchmark at extraordinary, anything short of extraordinary looks like failure. This does not mean the booking numbers are healthy. They may not be. But it does mean we need to be precise about what we are actually measuring before we assign a cause. There are at least 3 additional variables sitting underneath these figures that are not receiving serious attention. The first is pricing. Hotel rates in major American cities during summer 2026 have risen substantially compared to pre-pandemic averages. In some host markets, nightly rates during the tournament window are 2 to 3 times higher than the equivalent period in 2024. When the cost of accommodation increases at that rate, international travelers, particularly those from markets with weaker currencies relative to the US dollar, make different calculations. This is basic consumer economics. It does not require a political explanation. The second variable is competition. The UEFA Euro tournament in 2024 reset global football fan behavior in ways the industry is still processing. European supporters in particular demonstrated a strong preference for attending tournaments within accessible travel distance. A World Cup in North America carries a fundamentally different cost and logistics profile for the European fan base that historically drives significant international tourism spending at these events. The third variable is timing. Advanced booking patterns for major international sporting events have shifted meaningfully since 2020. The window between booking and travel has compressed. What looks like weak demand in May may look considerably different by the time the opening match kicks off on June 11th. None of these variables exonerate the booking figures. None of them make the AHLA survey data disappear. But they matter. They matter because serious analysis requires us to hold multiple explanations simultaneously before committing to one. Now, here is where it gets genuinely interesting, because those 3 variables, pricing, competition, timing, they can explain fluctuations in international booking patterns. They can explain a softer than expected European response. They can explain compressed booking windows. What they cannot easily explain is 15 consecutive months of declining Canadian travel to the United States, while Canadian outbound travel to other destinations holds steady or grows. Pricing does not explain that. European competition does not explain that. Booking window compression does not explain that. A trend that specific, that sustained, and that directional moving away from one destination while moving toward others simultaneously is a behavioral signal of a different order entirely. And that signal deserves its own analysis, which is exactly where we are going next. Let me put on a different hat for this section, because what I am about to walk you through is not economics. It is not tourism statistics. It is behavioral geography. And once you see it through this lens, the 15-month trend stops looking like a data anomaly and starts looking like something with a very specific shape. Here is the foundational principle. In the study of international relations, consumer behavior has long been recognized as a lagging indicator of geopolitical sentiment, not a leading indicator, a lagging one. By the time ordinary people start making different decisions about where they spend their money, where they travel, where they send their children to study, the underlying shift in sentiment has already been building for months, sometimes years, beneath the surface of official diplomatic language. We have seen this pattern before, precisely and documentably. When territorial tensions between China and South Korea escalated in 2016 over the deployment of the THAAD missile defense system, Chinese tourist arrivals in South Korea fell by nearly 50% within 12 months. No official boycott was declared. No government directive was issued to Chinese citizens telling them not to visit Seoul. The shift happened organically, driven by sentiment, by media environment, by a diffuse but powerful sense that spending money in that particular direction carried a social cost. When Russia's relationship with Western Europe fractured after February of 2022, Russian outbound tourism to European destinations did not wait for sanctions to take effect. The behavioral shift preceded the formal policy response. Consumer travel behavior, in periods of geopolitical friction, functions as a distributed referendum. Millions of individual decisions, each made privately, each based on personal calculation, but when aggregated, they produce a signal that is remarkably coherent. Now apply that framework to Canada and the United States in the period beginning early 2025. What was the media and policy environment in Canada during those 15 months? The renegotiation pressures surrounding the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement, tariff disputes across multiple sectors, public statements from Washington that generated significant coverage in Canadian media, a broader national conversation about economic sovereignty and the risks of deep dependence on a single trading partner. I want to be precise here. I am not telling you that Canadian consumers made a coordinated political decision to stop visiting the United States. I am telling you that the environment in which they were making individual travel decisions shifted substantially. And when environments shift, behavior follows. This is the mechanism that most analysis is missing entirely. The Buy Canadian movement that emerged during this period was not architected by the federal government in Ottawa. Mark Carney's administration pursued formal policy diversification, new trade frameworks with the European Union, deeper engagement with Southeast Asian partners, strengthened bilateral discussions with the United Kingdom. Those are documented policy positions. But the consumer sentiment that ran parallel to those policy shifts, that came from the ground up, from communities, from social networks, from the accumulated weight of 15 months of headlines. And here is the translation that I think matters most. When the entity that is your largest trading partner, your closest geographic neighbor, the destination for the majority of your outbound tourism for generations, when that entity becomes associated in the public mind with uncertainty, friction, and unpredictability, the psychological cost of traveling there increases. Not the financial cost, the psychological cost. The sense that going there carries a statement you may not want to make, that psychological friction does not show up in any official economic model. Oxford Economics cannot measure it. The AHLA survey cannot capture it. But Statistics Canada, simply by counting bodies crossing the border month after month, has been recording its effect with absolute precision. 15 months of data, 6.4% year over year in March of 2026 alone, and Canadian travelers going elsewhere instead. What I am describing is not a boycott in the formal sense. It is something quieter, more diffuse, and in many ways more durable. Formal boycotts end when political conditions change. Behavioral shifts in travel preference, once established, tend to persist well beyond the conditions that initially produced them. The hospitality industry calls this destination loyalty erosion, and it is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. That is what the numbers are showing us beneath the surface. That is what nobody is saying directly. And that brings us to the question that actually matters now, not what happened, but what comes next. Let me bring this down to ground level, because everything we have discussed so far, the behavioral geography, the distributed sentiment signals, the 15-month trend line, all of it exists at an altitude that can feel abstract. So let me do what I promised at the beginning of this analysis. Let me connect the macro to the micro. Let me show you what these numbers actually mean for real people on both sides of the border. We start in the United States. The Oxford economics projection was already modest. Localized GDP growth in leisure and hospitality. No material impact on national employment or economic output. That was the ceiling. That was the best case scenario built before the AHLA survey data arrived. Now consider what a sustained underperformance in World Cup hospitality bookings means at the city level. Not for the national economy, Oxford economics already told us that story, but for the individual hotel operator in Dallas running 140 rooms. For the restaurant owner in Miami who hired 12 additional seasonal staff based on projected tournament foot traffic. For the rideshare driver in Kansas City who restructured their schedule around expected surge demand across the full month of June 2026. These are not abstractions. These are business decisions that were made months ago based on projections that are now under pressure with 19 days remaining before the first match kicks off. The risk is not economic collapse. Let me be clear about that. The risk is a gap, a measurable, painful gap between what was planned for and what actually arrives. And in the hospitality sector, where margins are thin and staffing costs are fixed, gaps of that nature have direct consequences for the people closest to the operation. Now let us cross the border. For Canadian consumers, the redirection of travel spending has produced a set of second-order effects that are only beginning to show up in provincial economic data. Domestic tourism in Canada, particularly in British Columbia, Quebec, and Ontario, recorded increased activity during periods when cross-border travel to the United States declined. That is not a coincidence. That is substitution economics in real time. A Canadian family that historically drove to New York State for a long weekend in the spring of 2025 made a different calculation. Niagara on the Lake, Quebec City, Banff. The money that previously flowed south stayed inside the Canadian tourism ecosystem instead. For provincial hospitality operators, for local restaurants, for regional airlines serving domestic routes, that substitution represented genuine incremental revenue. The irony, and it is a significant irony, is that the bilateral friction which created anxiety at the policy level may have inadvertently delivered a stimulus to Canadian domestic tourism that no government program could have engineered deliberately. But here is the dimension that extends beyond both countries. The question that the World Cup booking figures are quietly forcing onto the table is this. When international travelers from Europe, from Asia, from South America are making their decisions about where to spend discretionary tourism dollars in summer 2026, how much does the ambient perception of a destination factor into that choice? Travel researchers call this destination image. It is the aggregate of news coverage, social media sentiment, personal networks, and lived experience that shapes whether a place feels welcoming, stable, and worth the investment of time and money. Destination image, once it shifts, moves slowly. It does not recover in a single season. It does not recover because a tournament happens to go well. It recovers through sustained, consistent signals sent over months and years that the destination is what it once was. That is the long-term variable hiding inside these short-term booking numbers. And that is precisely why the next 3 months matter far more than most people currently realize. So where does this go from here? I want to give you 3 scenarios. Not predictions, not guarantees. Scenarios grounded in the data we have examined together, mapped against the variables we know are in play, because that is the honest work of analysis. You hold the possibilities open. You watch which one the evidence moves toward. Scenario 1. Recovery and stabilization. The World Cup opens on June 11th. Walk-in demand, last-minute bookings, and the sheer gravitational pull of the tournament itself fills a meaningful portion of the gap between projection and reality. The hospitality sector underperforms its original forecasts but delivers a functional summer. Meanwhile, CUSMA renegotiations produce a framework that reduces bilateral friction. Canadian travel to the United States begins a gradual recovery through the fourth quarter of 2026. The 15-month trend line bends upward, the signal fades. Scenario 2. Structural entrenchment. The booking gap does not close. The World Cup delivers a competent but unremarkable economic performance in the host cities. More importantly, the behavioral shift in Canadian travel preference proves more durable than a single political cycle. Destination loyalty erosion, once established, compounds. Other international markets show similar, if smaller, signals of redirected tourism spending away from the United States. The hospitality industry begins a longer conversation about what changed and why. Scenario 3. The Canadian opportunity, Canada, positioned now as a demonstrated alternative for international travelers seeking a stable, welcoming North American destination, begins actively competing for the tourism dollars that are in motion. Provincial governments and federal tourism bodies accelerate investment in international destination marketing. The redirection that began as a consumer sentiment response becomes a deliberate economic strategy. 3 scenarios, 3 entirely different sets of consequences. And right now, in May of 2026, the data does not yet tell us which path we are on. That is what the next 90 days will answer. Here is my question for you. Which of these 3 scenarios do you believe the evidence is pointing toward? And if you are Canadian and you have personally changed your travel plans over the past year, I want to hear that story in the comments below. Subscribe, because on June 11th, this analysis continues.